Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. On December 1st, 1890, about 10,000 people reportedly gathered around the Alabama state capitol, just across the street from here, to hear a newly elected governor give what now ranks as one of the most controversial inaugural addresses ever in Alabama history. Now, when the campaign for governor had started earlier that year, few of any people in that crowd around the state capitol expected to hear this particular individual giving the inaugural address. The newly elected governor, Thomas Goode Jones, had won the fewest number of delegates of the 5 men participating in the Democrat primary for governor. However, none of those 5 men had garnered the 264 delegates needed to secure the nomination, making it so that the party's nominee would ultimately be determined at the Democratic State Convention in May of 1890. Now, many political observers in the state at the time expected Reuben F. Cobb, the Commissioner of Agriculture, to ultimately secure the nomination, as he only needed 27 more delegates to reach the 264 mark. However, the other 4 men vying for the nomination joined forces to oppose Cobb. The next step for those 4 men was to determine which of them the other 3 would unite behind. For if they all combined their pledged delegates behind one man, that person could secure the nomination. In the end, the men reluctantly agreed to unite behind Thomas Goode Jones. Why? Only because most of his 50 pledged delegates had pledged to vote for Commissioner Cobb if they could not cast their vote for Jones. So if Jones was out, then Cobb would be in. So Jones, in short, was a dark horse victor, a candidate who unexpectedly rocketed from last place to first in the convention, and who now, on a cool, clear December day, was being sworn in as the new governor of Alabama. It is likely that many in that crowd that day knew very little about the new governor, but generally expected him to govern in a similar fashion to the 4 Democrats who preceded him as governor. Jones appeared to be a part of the Democrat establishment. The most immediate indicator of this fact, of course, is that he helped to keep Commissioner Cobb from getting the nomination, something which many party leaders greatly desired, because Cobb was viewed as an outsider, someone whose economic policies in particular deviated from those traditionally associated with the Democrat Party. Jones, on the other hand, appeared to be a party man at a time, mind you, when the Democrat parties in the South touted itself first and foremost as the white man's party, the party of white supremacy. And at first glance, Jones appeared to possess all of the credentials that one would expect of a leader in the party of white supremacy. He was the son of a wealthy slave owner who owned one of the largest homes in Montgomery and who made his fortune building and managing some of the South's first railroads. He, Jones, the son, had been a cadet at the Virginia Military Institute when the Civil War started, and initially fought for the Confederacy under the command of one of his instructors at VMI, General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. He ended up spending the last 2 years of the war, however, in General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, where he served as aide-de-camp to General John Brown Gordon. Jones was wounded several times during the war, performed notable acts of bravery, and was ultimately chosen by General Lee to carry the first flag of truce to the Union lines at Appomattox. More importantly, when Jones returned home after the war, he helped his fellow Alabama Democrats end Republican rule and Reconstruction in the state. As an editor of a newspaper, the Montgomery Daily Picayune in 1868, Jones dedicated most of his editorials to denouncing Alabama Republican leaders as, quote, military despots, and to asserting that white Alabamians would never peacefully submit to what he called Negro rule. The next year, in 1869, Jones unsuccessfully ran as a Democrat for alderman in Montgomery. In the next three state elections, 1870, 1872, and 1874, Jones apparently served in an armed posse of Democrats who patrolled the streets of Montgomery during each election, ostensibly to maintain order, but most likely to intimidate Black and Republican voters. These efforts finally paid off for Jones and the Alabama Democrats in 1874, when the Democrats regained political control of Alabama, and Jones finally won a seat on the Montgomery City Council. Jones and the Democrats had finally succeeded in redeeming, quote unquote, Alabama from Republican rule. This was the start of what I will refer to as the New South period in Alabama history. Now, that phrase, New South, encompasses more than what I mean by it today. So let me kind of clearly articulate what I mean by the phrase, at least in this particular paper. That is, it refers to this movement by Southern Democrats to essentially turn back the clock, to make it so that the new post-bellum South resembled the old antebellum South as much as possible. Well, what are the defining characteristics of the old antebellum South? Primarily that whites were supreme in that society, and African Americans constitute an immobile, cheap labor force. However, leaders of the New South could not simply turn back the clock as they wished because of the Reconstruction era amendments, in particular, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment, as you know, prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. The 14th Amendment essentially declared African Americans to be citizens of the United States and prohibited state governments from abridging the privileges and immunities of American citizens. In addition, that amendment prohibited state governments from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And finally, it mandated that state laws equally protect all people within their borders. And the last of the Reconstruction era amendments, the 15th Amendment, sought to provide adult male African Americans the right to vote by prohibiting the government from denying any adult male of the right to vote because of his race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, leaders of the New South, including those here in Alabama, succeeded in sidestepping each of these amendments in their quest to restore white supremacy and to exploit and oppress African Americans. They got around the 13th Amendment through the systems of convict leasing and debt peonage, where thousands of African Americans were compelled to work in order to pay off a debt or as punishment for a crime. They got around the 14th Amendment ultimately through a number of means, but one that needs mentioning for our purposes here today is that of lynching, a practice where state and local governments basically turned a blind eye, allowed individuals to deprive African Americans not only of their 14th Amendment right to due process of law if accused of a crime, but of course ultimately deprive them of their very lives. And finally, as I'm sure you all know, they eventually got around the 15th Amendment by depriving adult males of the right to vote on the basis of ancestry, the grandfather clause, on the basis of how much wealth they owned, property requirements, how much they were willing and able to pay to vote, the poll tax, and finally by means of having corrupt, racist election officials declare that certain individuals were illiterate and therefore disqualified from voting, literacy test. So, Southern Democrats were in the early stages of instituting this New South program when Jones began to quickly ascend through the ranks of the Alabama Democrat Party. After serving for nearly a year on the Montgomery City Council, Jones was elected to the Alabama General Assembly in 1884. After just 2 years in the General Assembly, his colleagues elected him Speaker of the House, a position he held for 2 years until 1888, when he left the General Assembly to focus on running for governor in 1890. So, just a mere 6 years after first being elected to the General Assembly, Jones found himself standing at the top of that state capitol across the street, delivering the inaugural address as governor of Alabama. And much to the surprise and presumably the chagrin of many of his listeners, Governor Jones indicated in his address that he would not advance that New South white supremacy campaign as those before him had done. He revealed in his inaugural address that he was aware Democrats in the General Assembly were considering a proposal to prohibit tax monies paid by white Alabamians from being used to fund black public schools. According to the proposal being considered, only the relatively meager revenues generated by black taxpayers would be used to finance black public schools. According to Robert J. Darrell, quote, whites all over the South had been agitating for segregation of school taxes, end quote, since the 1880s, with one of the leading promoters of such a policy being John Tyler Morgan, one of Alabama's 2 U.S. senators. Jones, however, denounced this proposal as unwise and unconstitutional. Jones said that supporters of the proposal argue that, quote, educating a Negro is spoiling a good field hand. Well, in response to that, Jones argued that it should never be deemed the duty of a government to keep a class of its citizens in a state of ignorance and servility. Such would be the result, Jones argued, if that proposal ever became law, because black schools would go from receiving 45% of the tax revenue earmarked for public education to just 5%, because 95% of those tax revenues were paid by whites. After chastising his fellow Democrats for seeking to decimate black education in Alabama, Jones then attacked their plans to disenfranchise black voters by instituting educational qualifications to vote. Among other things, he urged legislators to consider how it would look to the outside world if Alabama woefully underfunded black public schools and then imposed educational qualifications to vote. Jones argued that it would be better for Alabama in the long run if its African-American citizens were educated. And he said the U.S. Constitution demands that the state treat its citizens, black and white, equally and impartially. Finally, Jones further surprised and alienated many of his fellow Democrats by calling upon legislators to end the state's convict leasing system. The system generated significant revenue for the state as big businesses and landowners paid the state to exploit the labor of the state's prisoners. In addition, those who leased those prisoners were also responsible for housing and feeding them, thus saving Alabama from paying those expenses. Jones, however, argued in that inaugural address, quote, revenue should not be the chief consideration, end quote, when evaluating this system. And by Jones's assessment of that system, it was harsh, inhumane, and regressive, he said. A majority of the convicts in the leasing system, he said, were African Americans, with most of them working in the state's coal mines, and that rather than it rehabilitating them, the system instead made it so that, quote, society needs greater protection against them after they leave the system than before they entered it, end quote. The reaction to Jones's address, his inaugural address in the state's Democrat newspapers the following day, ranged from those who were simply stunned to those which angrily denounced the new governor. Now, how did the legislature respond to Jones's inaugural? Well, they did set aside any plans they had for calling a constitutional convention to disenfranchise African Americans. It also jettisoned the proposal to segregate education funds. However, in its place, they crafted a policy where the state sent education funds to the superintendent of each township, who in turn would distribute those funds to the black and white schools in the township. Now, that law stipulated he was to dispense those funds on a, quote, just and equitable basis, end quote. And Jones signed this bill into law. But apparently that phrase, just and equitable, was open to interpretation, as many superintendents distributed more funds to the white schools than to the black. And finally, on the issue of convict leasing, the legislature refused to consider the matter directly, but instead established a special commission to investigate it. By Jones's request, the governor was made an ex officio member of that commission. Although Jones had compelled the legislature to alter its plan some, the governor nevertheless felt alienated from his party and questioned his prospects for winning a second term. Because gubernatorial terms in Alabama at that time were just 2 years long, Jones had to consider such matters almost as soon as his first term began. In fact, just 3 months after giving that inaugural address, the 1892 campaign for governor basically started up. Because in February of 1891, Representative Samuel M. Adams, who was also president of the Alabama Farmers Alliance, boldly declared that Reuben F. Cobb would win the Democratic nomination and be the state's next governor. So that started the campaign just 3 months after Jones is getting his feet wet as governor. Cobb officially declared his intention to win the Democrat nomination 5 months later in July. Meanwhile, Jones had been indicating in his private correspondence that he likely would not seek re-election. But two things changed his mind. One, Cobb and his supporters kept claiming that Jones had robbed him of the governorship in 1890. Jones intensely guarded his honor and didn't take criticism very well. Secondly, Democrat leaders were urging Jones to run so as to keep Cobb out of the governor's seat. And so in October of 1891, Jones indeed declared his candidacy for the Democrat nomination. Thus commenced one of the most tumultuous elections in Alabama history, the gubernatorial election of 1892. Because I'm really focusing on race, I'm going to give this election short shrift, but I'll tell you the basic story. Jones won most of the county primaries, which were held between December 1891 and April 1892. In fact, he won enough delegates in those primaries to secure the nomination before the state Democrat convention was held in June. Dissatisfied with those results, of course, Commissioner Cobb and his supporters formed a new party, what they called the Jeffersonian Democrat Party, and they held their own convention. And at that convention, the delegates, of course, nominated Cobb for governor and adopted a platform that mirrored the one adopted by the Populist Party that same year. So it's essentially the Populist Party, but under a different name. After a raucous general election campaign, and after the votes were tallied, the election results showed that Jones had defeated Cobb by 11,000 votes. Now, outside of the Black Belt counties, those counties where most black Alabamians resided, Cobb had actually defeated Jones by 15,000 votes. But Jones's margin of victory in the Black Belt was an unheard of 26,000, thus propelling him past Cobb for the victory. Cobb and his supporters once again cried that he had been cheated out of the governorship. They accused Democratic election officials in those Black Belt counties of election fraud, of essentially casting votes for the thousands and thousands of African Americans in those counties who were registered to vote, but who were intimidated from ever trying to do so. There's no other way to explain the results in those counties. Even if Jones won the vote of every single white voter in the Black Belt counties, he still needed 60% of the votes of every black registered voter to get that margin. Now, Jones insisted until his death that that is precisely what happened, that he fairly won those votes in the Black Belt, black votes in particular. However, it is unimaginable that so many African Americans willingly voted Democrat in 1892, even for someone like Jones, who came across at that time at least as a moderate on race matters. So, after winning, or rather securing, his bid for re-election, Jones continued to oppose important components of the Democrats' white supremacy campaign. In his first message to the Democrat-dominated General Assembly after his re-election, Jones urged legislators to finance the construction of a state penitentiary as the first step to ending the convict leasing system. Of course, if you're going to end the convict leasing system, you need a place to put the state's prisoners, and there wasn't a penitentiary to put them in yet. In that same message, Jones once again felt compelled to head off a movement amongst Democrat lawmakers to rewrite or amend the Constitution so as to disenfranchise African Americans. Taking such a step, Jones argued, would not only violate the spirit and intent of the 15th Amendment, but would also cause future problems. He prophetically asserted that, quote, this is Jones speaking, the withdrawal from freemen, African Americans, who have once exercised the right of suffrage, being able to vote, of all political power in a popular government, which shapes their destinies and makes their laws, is sure to create a servile class. That would be the end result, end quote. And such a class, particularly if it's large in number, would eventually constitute, Jones said, a cancer on the life of the state, end quote. That is how he viewed the disenfranchisement of blacks. Jones went on to say, their resentments, the resentments of African Americans who would potentially lose the right to vote, their resentments and their constant struggle to regain those lost rights, and that struggle, which is sure to be aided by some who have political power, it will inevitably breed continued and ever-increasing discontent and agitation, the magnitude of which in the end will bring greater evils to the state than any which the disenfranchisement was intended to cure. He's begging Alabama not to go down the road of disenfranchising African Americans in the 1890s. Likewise, Jones once again fought against his own party on the matter of segregating the funding of public schools. Knowing the governor would veto any bill they passed, Democrat lawmakers passed a proposed constitutional convention, which did not need a governor's signature. This proposed amendment stipulated that tax money collected from whites could be applied exclusively to the education of white students. When the General Assembly passed this proposed amendment over Jones's objections, he wrote an official protest to it and had the Secretary of State place it in this very building. And when the proposed amendment was placed before the state's voters during the 1894 election, Jones campaigned against it, and it was narrowly defeated. At the same time that the members of the General Assembly were passing that proposed amendment, Jones sent them a separate message instructing them to take radical steps to end a key part of the Democrats' white supremacy campaign, the lynching of African Americans. Now, Jones informed the legislature that he had deployed the state militia more than a dozen times in the previous 2 years to stop lynch mobs, but that in every instance, the mob had completed its work and had dispersed by the time the militia arrived. Local law enforcement officials, Jones asserted, were in the best position to stop a lynching, but all too often either turned a blind eye to lynch mobs or actually joined them. Therefore, Jones asked the legislature to authorize the governor to fire negligent sheriffs when it came to lynching. Secondly, because lynch mobs were oftentimes quite sizable, Jones also asked the General Assembly to make it easier for a local sheriff to organize a posse to confront lynch mob members. Jones suggested they pass a law making it illegal for any citizen to refuse a sheriff's request to join such a posse. And then, to the amazement of many political observers, Jones suggested that if a sheriff needed men to confront a lynch mob, that he be authorized to arm the prisoners in his jail and include them in the posse, with the promise that their jail sentence would be reduced if they aided the effort to stop that lynching. These were extreme proposals, radical proposals. The famous anti-lynching crusader, Ida B. Wells, said in response, quote, "No stronger nor more effective words have been said in the effort to eradicate lynching than those from Governor Jones," end quote. However, the legislature did not even consider, much less pass, any of Governor Jones's anti-lynching proposals. During the next 2 years of his governorship, dozens of African Americans were lynched in the state of Alabama. Even though Jones did not succeed in getting lawmakers to try to end lynchings, he did succeed in getting them to take steps to abolish the convict leasing system. On February 9th, 1893, just a few days after Jones sent the Assembly his anti-lynching proposals, they passed a bill, which he signed into law, authorizing the removal of all convicts from the mines as rapidly as practicable and for the purchase of land to build a new penitentiary. So he did get that accomplished before leaving the governorship. However, Jones was surprised when listening to the inaugural address of his successor, William Calvin Oates, a Democrat, when Oates called for maintaining the convict leasing system. He asserted that the cost of building the penitentiary and maintaining the prisoners would place an undue burden on the state's budget. So in one of its first acts in its 1895 session, the state legislature of Alabama reversed its plan to end the convict leasing system. Alabama went from being on track to being the first southern state to end convict leasing to eventually being the last to do so. Alabama did not end convict leasing until 1928. From 1895 until 1928, the convict leasing system in Alabama was made up of 90% of African Americans. 90% of the convicts in that system were African Americans. As governor, Jones had sought to lead his party down a different path in the matter of race relations, but it did not follow his lead. Instead, the Alabama Democrat Party continued to pursue its white supremacy campaign and sought to cap it off with a constitutional convention where they would disenfranchise African Americans. And in 1901, they got their wish. Now, after leaving the governor's mansion, Jones had just resumed his law practice, but he gets elected as a delegate to the 1901 Alabama State Constitutional Convention, and he picks right up where he left off as governor. He unsuccessfully, unfortunately, advocated that his anti-lynching proposals be put in the new Constitution. He again opposed, but this time was successful in thwarting the attempt to again base the funding of public schools on race. But most significantly, he emerged as the leader of a very small group of delegates who opposed the main purpose of the Constitutional Convention, the disenfranchisement of African Americans. In several long, impassioned speeches, and in a series of heated debates, one of which grew violent, this is all on the floor of the Constitutional Convention, Jones denounced the effort to take the right to vote away from African Americans, denounced it as unjust, immoral, and unconstitutional. Nevertheless, the delegates overwhelmingly approved an article that stipulated that one could vote in Alabama only if he was literate, owned a certain amount of property, paid a poll tax, and could prove that he was directly related to someone eligible to vote in Alabama before the Civil War. When the Constitution went into effect at the end of 1901, Alabama had the most stringent and effective disenfranchisement laws of any state in the Union. Before the 1901 Constitution, there were about 85,000 African American men registered to vote in the state. After 1901, that figure was less than 4,000. 85,000 to 4,000. Just a week after that 1901 Constitution went into effect, Judge John Bruce, one of Alabama's federal judges, died. The man who would pick his replacement was Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican who had just become president a month earlier as a result of the assassination of President William McKinley. Alabama Democrats, delighted by the prospect of replacing Bruce. Bruce was a Union veteran from Iowa who had been appointed to the bench by Ulysses S. Grant. Those Democrats inundated the White House with resumes and recommendations for his replacement. Another Alabamian who, like his Democrat counterparts, sent a recommendation to Theodore Roosevelt upon hearing of Bruce's death was Booker T. Washington, the black leader and head of Alabama's Tuskegee Institute. In addition to a telegram, Washington sent the president a letter via a personal messenger urging him to appoint Jones to the vacancy, informing Roosevelt that Jones, quote, stood up in the Constitutional Convention and elsewhere for fair election law, opposed lynching, and he has been outspoken for the education of both races, end quote. After discussing Jones's candidacy with Washington via telegram, the Republican appointed Jones, a Southern Democrat, to the federal judiciary. Democrats initially celebrated the appointment, but quickly became worried. Because now, their new Constitution could be judged by one of the individuals in the convention who opposed it, if a case could be brought before the federal court. And those fears were realized when a black janitor at the Montgomery post office named Jackson Giles filed suit in federal court asserting that the Alabama Constitution violated rights guaranteed to him by the U.S. Constitution. In a confidential letter, Washington asked Judge Jones, to send the case directly to the U.S. Supreme Court rather than handing down a ruling. So Jones does not speak or rule on the constitutionality of the Constitution because Booker T. Washington requests that he send it to the Supreme Court. It seems that Washington was concerned that if Jones handed down a ruling, it would be appealed and would be subject to delays and challenges and would keep it in legal limbo for years. So Jones complied with Washington's request The case went directly to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against Giles, and Alabama's Constitution remained in effect. Washington was hoping that a Republican-dominated Supreme Court would strike it down, and it didn't. Soon after this disappointing turn of events, Judge Jones learned that an old white farmer had been murdered near his home in Huntsville, Alabama. Jones also learned that when someone informed the Huntsville police that they had seen a black man named Horace Maples with the farmer earlier that day, the police arrested Maples. Thousands of people descended upon the jail that Maples was in, set fire to it. The sheriff, then seeking to save the jail, pushed Maples out the window, where he was beaten and then lynched. Upon hearing this, Judge Jones ordered the U.S. attorney to arrest any known members of the mob, not only upon hearing this, but when state and local officials did nothing about it, and to charge them with depriving Maples of civil rights guaranteed to him by the U.S. Constitution. No American had been convicted of a crime for participating in a lynching. And that's precisely what Jones was advocating now, not only being convicted of a crime, but a federal crime. After two individuals were arrested, Jones impaneled the federal grand jury, gave a 2-hour charge to that jury, explaining how the two men violated the 13th and 14th Amendments by lynching Maples. And the jury agreed. Unfortunately, before the case could go to trial, the United States Supreme Court handed down its decision in a case known as Hodges versus the United States. And in that case, the Supreme Court completely rejected or undermined the very arguments Jones had made in his 2-hour charge, thus making it so that there's no reason to go forward with the prosecution against the two men, because the constitutional argument for doing so had just been rejected by the Supreme Court. Probably the thing that Jones did as federal judge that was more controversial than anything else, however, was a fight against debt peonage. As judge, Jones struck down one Alabama law sanctioning debt peonage and got the Supreme Court to strike down a second one in a case known as Bailey versus Alabama, a case that Jones and Washington, Booker T. Washington, worked together secretly behind the scenes to get to the Supreme Court. And that Bailey v. Alabama decision was the first decision by the Supreme Court ruled in favor of African Americans in over 30 years. And that case came out of Alabama and was directed to the court by Booker T. Washington and Thomas Goode Jones. In closing, I say that when Jones was governor and then federal judge, the American South, led by Southern Democrats, had entered into a phase that historians call a period of radical racism, where those leaders, were advocating, again, decimating black education, championing lynching, things along those lines. Thomas Goode Jones, as governor and judge, not only denounced those things politically, but put forth a constitutional interpretation that would have made it so that the federal government would come in to protect the civil rights of African Americans. And this at a time when no one else is proposing this, and a Northern Republican Supreme Court rejected it. In conclusion, what Jones advocated, his vision for the South and for race relations in the South and equal justice in the South, if it had been followed by Alabamians, by the Supreme Court, then arguably there would have never been a need for a civil rights movement. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Aucoin, and thank you all for coming. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and either myself or Mary Beth over there will pass you the microphone. We're recording today's session on YouTube. She's coming your way.
To your knowledge, how much attention does Governor Jones get in the Alabama history courses in Alabama public schools?
Well, that's a great question, and one that I don't know the answer to, and maybe someone in here can answer it for us. I'd love to know the answer to that, but my general impression is that those who, outside of a certain segment of the population, those who know about Jones just know of him from his son's promotion of the image of his father as a Confederate hero and as a good governor. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for a very mind-opening presentation.
Thank you.
What's the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party during 1890 and 2017?
1890 and 2017? Okay. Well, different than the Democratic Party and Republican Party. Well, with regard to race, in the early part of that period, the Democrat Party is unabashedly promoting white supremacy. We are the party of white supremacy. The Republican Party, at least in its rhetoric and its platform, is advocating equal civil rights, but it's not really doing much about it. There's not action to back up those words. That eventually will get reversed. They'll sort of switch their views on race and equal justice because of the Great Depression and other political things going on. And so we get to the situation where we're at today. But there's a lot more to answering that question than I can give in a format like this. But that gives a general sense of at least how I see those two parties in the time period you mentioned. But thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you. I have a two-part question. The first part is, how did Governor Jones make happily the change that he made? Because everything you said in the beginning of the introduction, to me, he was a pure racist. It seems like he had some type of metamorphosis that changed his thinking. So number one, what happened there to make that change? And number two, has anyone ever compared Alabama's form of the lynching? I thought right away of the cartel in Mexico and how they were bought by the police and how it's the police and the cartel. Has anyone ever put the two together as a comparison?
Okay. Thank you for those questions. I've struggled to explain what appears to be a kind of a switch on Jones's part with regard to race relations. I think there are a number of factors. In short, I do think he came to have a vision of just what he thought America should become, particularly what the South should become. He wanted the South to prosper, to go into the future, stable politically, and prospering economically. And he thought that couldn't happen if you had this racial turmoil. Another thing is, soon after the Civil War was over, Jones became briefly a sort of a national figure when he started touring the parts of the country calling for reconciliation between the sections, speaking primarily to veteran groups, but Union veterans and Confederate veterans, having been a Confederate veteran himself. And I think that's his first taste of sort of being in the limelight. And it came by means of promoting a message of peace and unity. And when he moves into the political realm, particularly in the 1890s, what he is seeing is not peace and unity. He's really seeing hatred. He is seeing Democrat leaders in his own state and elsewhere in the South saying just the worst possible things you can say about a race, particularly about African Americans. And he thought that sort of rhetoric was not going to get the South in America where it needed to go, where it needed to be in the 20th century and beyond, that it was going to cause problems if they stayed on that trajectory. As for the question regarding lynching, I haven't seen a comparison, say an international comparison. What scholars have really demonstrated is simply that lynching was used to enforce white supremacy. It was just they used the law to do that at times, but this was an extra legal way of doing it. African Americans should know their place, and if they do that, then everyone will be fine from a white perspective. And the way we enforce that is lynching. Black person challenges that status quo, that system, then he or she was subject to lynching.
I'm sorry, I've forgotten where he was born and where his family lived. But what and how would you compare North Alabama, Morgan, Winston County with black belt mindset?
Jones was born in what is today Macon, Georgia,
Macon, okay.
and but came to Montgomery as a child. And I don't know of him ever living, no, actually, he lived in Montgomery until he was in mid-teens, and then he was shipped off to Virginia for school, ultimately going through some preparatory academies and then VMI. So Jones, if he's anything, he's just a product of Montgomery, of this part of the state. Now, with someone like Jones and what he did as a federal judge, or at least what he attempted to do and the things he said, he's oftentimes compared to Frank Johnson, who hailed from the northern part of the state. And that's oftentimes used to explain Johnson, not completely, but why did Johnson do what he did? Well, in part, he came from a part of the state that had a different view of race than the rest of the state. But that doesn't really explain Jones. And so we have to look to other factors to explain why Jones did what he did.
Dr. Vickery, did you have a question? Dr. Vickery, did you have a question? I saw your hand up.
You've studied the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention of 1901, and I can't resist asking this question because of that. My impression has been over the years that the problems we have in state government in Alabama all flow from that Constitution, and in part it was inadvertent, is my semi-conclusion. That is, in the rush to disenfranchise blacks and illiterate whites in Alabama, that convention created a form of state government with all power vested in the legislature and virtually no power vested locally. Did you run across any views on that subject by Governor Jones that, I don't remember you mentioning it in the book, you may have, but that are relevant to that? Was anybody, including him, even aware of what they were doing in the long run in order to disenfranchise those groups?
That's a great question, and frankly, it's one that had not occurred to me while I was going through the proceedings of the convention. I don't recall Jones ever addressing the actual sort of the distribution of power in the government that they were creating. That doesn't mean he didn't, or that he didn't have an opinion on it. It's just that really I was so focused on what was going on with regard to race that those sorts of things probably didn't catch my attention that much. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to your question, but I would like to know it. It's an important question to answer.
I saw her hand up first.
Inasmuch as Jones was trying to eradicate peonage and slavery, why do you think he carried the black belt counties when he ran?
The prevailing explanation for why he carried the black belt counties is simply the custom, the practice in those counties was for Democratic election officials to engage in election fraud on behalf of Democratic candidates. That's it. And so Jones, to his death, not only disputed that, which I don't buy as much as I'm sympathetic to Jones, but it's also clear even those scholars, let's say, who are much more skeptical of Jones than I am, pretty negative towards Jones, they nevertheless agree. Jones didn't advocate or didn't instruct or command that election fraud be done on his behalf. So I think the reason he carried the black belt is because that's how sort of the Democrat establishment won elections in Alabama. And they admitted to as much at the 1901 Constitutional Convention when they said, we've got to rewrite the Constitution so that we stop stealing votes in the black belt because it's embarrassing to do that. And it's not a secure way of winning elections. So let's just go ahead and legally disenfranchise African Americans.
We have one last question right here.
In the 1912 election, Theodore Roosevelt formed the Bull Moose Party. I know you don't know, and I don't know. Who do you think that Booker T. Washington voted for in that election?
Oh, Taft or Roosevelt?
Or Roosevelt?
I would imagine Roosevelt. Washington and Roosevelt seem to have a very close relationship.
Yeah.
One of the things that amazed me in writing this book was learning that the very day that Theodore Roosevelt became president, the president of the United States has been assassinated, eventually dies, shot and eventually dies, and he becomes president. And on that very day, he pins a letter to Booker T. Washington saying, I will be contacting you from this point forward for basically directions on what I'm going to do in the South, for all appointments in the South. It just amazes me that he would look to a black person in that day and time for such guidance, and that he would do that on the very day he became president. So they had a very close relationship.
Who do you think Thomas Goode Jones voted for?
He
Woodrow
loved
Wilson
Roosevelt.
Taft?
No, I think he would have voted, if I had to guess, I'd say Roosevelt, just because of their relationship as well.
All right, thank you again for coming, and thank you, Dr. And they'll probably start coming up to you for questions.
No, I mean...